In this video, we'll be replacing the rear wheel bearing on this 2005 Honda Element. We're going to remove the rear wheel. It's going to be a 19 millimeter. Go ahead and take off the lug nuts now. So we're going to remove our caliper and caliper bracket. It's going to be 14 millimeters. We'll start here. And we'll keep an eye on this inside nut. If this inside nut spins, then we're going to have to use a wrench in here to stop it. And so far, so good. We'll move up top. So our brake hose here is really tight going to our caliper. So instead of stressing that brake hose and trying to stretch it, we're just going to take this bolt out here, which will give us a little more room to remove our caliper. And then this bolt is a 12 millimeter. And what we're going to do here is take this bolt out, take this bracket with the brake hose away, and put our bolt right back in so we don't lose it. Just a few threads. And now we have more room to remove our caliper. So now what we're going to do is take our caliper, slide it off of our pads. And for right now, we will end up moving it again, but for right now, I'm going to rest it right there on the lower arm. We can take off our brake pads. And then we'll move into our caliper bracket. Going to be two bolts. They're going to be 14 millimeter. Now we'll just have to move this a little bit more. And your caliper bracket should come right out. Now moving to our rotor, you can see we have one Phillips screw. You should have two Phillips screws. If you do have two Phillips screws, go ahead and remove them both. We only have one, so we'll be doing this one. Now once your Phillips screw is removed, you should be able to give your rotor a little tap and work it straight off. So what we're going to need to do now is take off this axle nut, but you can see it's been staked into the axle. So we're going to have to bend that back out so we can spin the nut out. I'm going to start here with a punch. We may move to a flathead screwdriver just to straighten it out. Now the goal here is just to be able to spin the nut out, not to recreate and make this round. You should be replacing this nut. You don't want to restake that, as it'll probably break. So now that we have this opened up enough, let's get a socket and back out that nut. So now with a 32 millimeter socket, we'll take off the axle nut. So now we're going to push our axle back as much as we can. You can try and use a hammer right here, as long as you're hitting it flat. That's okay. If that doesn't work for you, try and get a punch in that center. Push back. Now our vehicle is a four-wheel drive, so we have a full axle, which means that this is going to stay here. It's not going to come out the back in a small piece. All right, so the goal here was just to loosen that up. And then we'll go ahead and pull our hub. So now that we have our puller in place, mounted to a few studs, we're going to try and pull out our hub. Now you can see our hub pulled out with the race or part of your bearing. So in this case, you would have to cut this off to reuse your hub, although we're going to be replacing the hub. So we're going to need to remove our speed sensor. It is actually into the bearing itself, so this is going to need to come out. It's going to be a 10 millimeter. And ours just broke. So our bolt on our speed sensor broke, which doesn't look good for the rest of the sensor. What you would want to do is slowly wiggle your sensor out using a little rust penetrant, a little patience. So we went ahead and did that, and it turns out that this plate broke, which means the rest of our speed sensor is stuck in here. So for us, we're going to have to replace the speed sensor cable. So we're going to unplug our cable. We're going to end up cutting it here and drilling it out and move forward. So now on the back of our knuckle, you can see we have a few bolts facing outwards. This here is a nut, and that's going to be coming through your backing plate. This has to come off as well, so there's one on each side. So we'll start here, work our way down. We also have a large nut on the top here. We have to take that one out as well. We'll start here. It's going to be 14 millimeter for all these little ones. So coming straight across the top, we're going to come in between the axle and the spring. The last nut we have is right up here on top of the axle. That's going to be a 22 millimeter. So now that you have all your nuts and bolts removed from the back of your hub, and right here, your backing plate, your parking brake shoes and this backing plate and the hub should pull forward. Now ours is a little bit corroded, so it's probably not going to move, so we will try a pry bar here between the backing plate and the knuckle. See if we can get any movement. And again, this is the backing plate, so we're not trying to bend this. Just trying to introduce a little bit of movement if possible. No? Okay. So our backing plate is really rough, and it's going to fall apart. So we decided to use our studs to hit forward our backing plate and parking brakes. So we're sacrificing these studs knowing that we're going to replace it. So we are trying to, right in here, get a little bit of gap going between the backing plate and this bearing face. So we have a little bit of separation going here. I'm just going to continue to work. So we're going to remove our parking brake shoes because we're going to remove our backing plate. We're also going to replace our backing plate. So to make it easy, that way we're not damaging anything, we have to take them off anyway, just take off our parking shoes. We're going to start with the bottom spring. We're going to mix between a pair of needle nose pliers and a hook tool. We're going to focus now on the top two springs here. And the same thing here. So now what we'll do is work on this pin here. There's a little notch at the end. We're going to grab that notch, spin it 90 degrees, and that'll release the clip and the shoe. So with that pin released, we can then take out our adjustment wheel. Well, we're going to hold our shoe in place, and we're going to rotate the bottom out and take out our adjustment wheel. And with this shoe in hand, we're going to rotate now the top out and take out our strut and spring. Now this side is attached to the parking brake cable, so we can rotate that out and just let that hang while we work on the other side. Now this side, we can take out our green spring now and just rotate it out of this little area here. And our clip and pin here. Again, pair of needle nose pliers, I'll rotate that pin 90 degrees, release the clip, and this side, the only thing that's left is the clip and the shoe, so we can just remove that right off of the backing plate, and the clip will come out. Now our pin, just push the pin back, reach around the back, and remove your pin. So the only thing that's left here is our parking brake cable, and the head is locked in here. We're going to remove that by grabbing the head of our cable with our needle nose pliers and our parking brake shoe arm, and we're going to pull the two away from each other, which is compressing the spring, and then we'll rotate that cable right out. So our backing plate was pretty well rusted to the surface of the bearing. So we're using the two backing plate bolts. We will be replacing the backing plate. So we're using the two backing plate bolts to push it forward. Have an air hammer. So now you can tell things are a little bit different than where we left off. Our back bolt here has mushroomed pretty good, and we're having an issue with this bolt being stuck. So what we've done is removed our backing plate. We will be replacing this. So we removed our backing plate, and this is the area here that we're working with. This is the head of this bolt. So to get this out of the way, we went ahead and broke that. Now again, this is just because this bolt is stuck that we've now come up front and we're trying to push this stud rearwards, push it straight out. Now we've got it to move. We're just going to continue to push on that. After we get this stud out, then we can work on removing our bearing. So we're going to push from the front on this stud rearwards. So we have a guide pin from a caliper that we've shaved down to make it nice and loose, but it'll fit in there. And we're going to use our air hammer on the head of this bolt. So now what we're going to do is try and get our bearing free from the knuckle. And you can see there's a tiny little gap here going on between the bearing and the knuckle. We're just going to use a 5-pound sledge and see if we can open up that gap a little bit further. What we're trying to do is get this much bearing out of the knuckle. So this is what we're looking at, where this much bearing is inside this knuckle that's rusted and seized in place for us, and this is what we're trying to get forward and out. So now after hitting it and using the air hammer, working it left and right and pushing it outwards, it should be ready to remove. So now that we have our bearing out, you can see our speed sensor is actually broken in, and the bottom piece of it broke off inside here. While we're in here, you can see we have a lot of rust and corrosion around this flange and on the inside. We're going to spend a few minutes now and clean this area up. We're going to use some brake clean and a surface preparation disc, which is not a sandpaper. You don't really want to take off material. We just want to clean it up to nice bare metal. Start with some brake clean. We'll make sure to let this dry up before we use our surface preparation pad, as there may be a couple of unwanted sparks. So now you can see we're moving our axle back and forth. Unless you wanted to take your axle out, you're going to have to work around it to clean this inner surface. We want this inner surface nice and smooth for our new bearing to go in. Unfortunately, we won't be able to use the disc in here, and you can in very limited areas. We'll try. So now we're going to take out this piece here, which on the inside is where your springs go on your parking shoes. This is also on the back side, that 22mm nut. So on the front here, or on the inside, we're going to be looking at a 10mm bolt. So now this piece here, we're going to transfer over to our new backing plate. Our springs are going to mount to this piece here, which means this piece is going to go on the outside of our plate. The side that has these studs sticking out will be the back side. So we're going to put our piece through, and to get your holes to line up, it can only go one way. The holes won't line up the other way. We're going to put our piece through, and then from the back side in, we're going to thread in our bolts to hold that plate in place. So now that we have our bolts in, we can go ahead and tighten them down. And now we can take our backing plate to the vehicle. So now we're ready to take our bearing and put it into the vehicle here. And what we want to do is, before we put our bearing in place, we're going to put a nice light coat of grease on the inside that will help protect against moisture and corrosion. So now we can also just do a real light coat here if you decide. Again, just protection against moisture and corrosion. And take our bearing on the side that's going to go into our knuckle. Just a little bit of light grease on that bearing side, not the flange. And now we're ready to put our bearing in. We're going to align our axle through the center of the bearing, which sometimes is easier done by putting the axle most of the way in place. I'm going to take our notch for our speed sensor and loosely line that up. And then our other bolt holes should be lined up within reason. We should be able to push our bearing into place. We have a little bit of gap left over. We'll finish that with a rubber mallet. So now we have our bearing lined up, and we went ahead and made sure that our bolt holes are as close as they're going to be. We can take a rubber mallet, we can pull our axle backwards a little bit, so we're not hitting our axle, but we're hitting our actual bearing. And just give it a tap in the rest of the way. Now there may be a small chance that there's still a little gap there, which is okay. The bolts will pull it in the rest of the way, but you want to get it in as close as you can before you get to your bolts. We look like we're in great shape. And it did shift a little bit. There we go. Now we can put on our backing plate. I'm going to align our axle shaft again. We're going to take our backing plate. You'll notice you have two studs. One's longer than the other. All right. Your opening here is going to go towards the back, and you're going to have to work that longer stud in first and then angle in the rest. And it's going to be just a matter of walking it in. Now if you get hung up, give it a couple of taps. But you don't want to bend your backing plate, and you don't want to force this point. If you give it a couple of taps like we're doing and it is walking in, then go ahead and keep going. If it's not walking in, your bearing may have shifted and you may be actually hitting these up against the knuckle. So you want to go ahead and reset your alignment on the holes. You can see we are doing a little damage here, so we'll stop. We'll fix that. You don't want to leave this rim bent over. Your shoes, your parking brake shoes, are going to ride inside here, and they're going to ride very close. Our parking brake cable is going to come through this slot here. We'll put the bolts in after, but for now we're just going to put the cable end through so that way we don't forget it. And what we can actually do is start to rebuild our parking brake assembly. So we're going to start to attach our parking brake shoes. We're going to start down here on our parking brake cable. What we're going to need to do is push our spring back to get the head of this cable in here. So it's going to come through straight through here. What we're going to do to get the spring pushed back is a pair of needle nose pliers. We're going to pull it back with our finger, just enough to get the pliers in there. And then we're going to separate the two and then squeeze down to hold that spring back. Then we can take our parking brake cable and put the head and the end in place. So now we're going to take our shoes on this side and put it into position. We're going to take the round notch, set it up in top here. What that'll do is allow us to align the back hole where our pin is going to come through. So from the back we can push our pin all the way through. We're going to align our pin through that hole on the shoe. And that is going to go through our clip here. So the round part in the clip is going to go in the back, and the slot is going to go in the front. Now our pin needs to also be lined up with the slot, which is vertical. And we can take a straight pair of needle nose on the clip, push straight back so we can grab the pin and rotate the pin. Just like that. So now we're going to come to the other side. We're going to put our shoe into position. But before we put our pin and clip through, we're going to put our adjuster in place. Our adjuster is going to go right here between these two areas. Okay, so our adjuster is now set in place. We can put our pin in from the back through this center hole. And ideally you're going to hold that pin from the back with a finger. Try and keep that pin up and down, vertical. You take your clip, line it up, and push and twist. So now what we're going to do is install our strut. It's going to go with this notch, or this hole here for your spring on the outside, and the curve set like this. It's going to go into these two notches here. We'll start by putting the back side in first. It's going to go up against your parking brake arm. You'll see your parking brake arm sitting back here. Well, so we're going to push that away. We're going to pull our parking brake shoe on this side just a little bit. We're going to line up the notches, and we're going to push closed. Make sure that that's actually in place before we put our spring in. Our spring is going to go like this. The back side is going to go right in that hole, and that's what's going to go in first, is the back. You can take a hook tool, a pair of needle nose pliers, whatever you need to expand your spring, stretch your spring, and get it onto that strut. So now we're going to work on the top springs that go on both sides on this pin here, or this arm. In this little corner here in there is this little cutout, triangular cutout we're going to put back half of the spring into. And we're going to take the other half and stretch it around this pin here. We're going to do the same on the other side. Now you notice there's a little bit of difference in the sides of the springs. One side will fit in here cleanly, and the other one will not. Now that that's done, we can work down the bottom. We have one spring going right across here. The green spring is going to go in here and hook, and we're going to come across. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. And it's going to sit right there. Once you have all your springs, your strut, your adjuster in place, and your pins are good, we're going to take a look at the outside here and make sure that we're even on both sides. And if things aren't even, or if you just want to check to make sure everything's in place, grab your shoes, squeeze them together, give this a little rotation left and right. Sometimes that'll help fit things into place if they're shifted out just a little. Everything looks good. Now we can move on. We're going to start reinstalling our bolts. We have a top bolt here, and it's going to be a 14 millimeter, but we're going to get everything started by hand. And we're going to come in with our impact and just snug them up. And we'll move down right underneath that for our backing plate stud. I'm going to put our nut on top of that. So now we're going to come down the bottom. Now we can put our top bolt in. And now we can put our nut on our stud here. And now we have our top 22 millimeter nut. Now that we have all of our bolts and nuts in place, we'll come back and torque it all down. So now we have a few different torque specs on the back of our bearing. On the nuts for the backing plate, they're going to be 28 foot-pounds. On the bolts, they're going to be 38 foot-pounds. On the large nut, 22 millimeter nut on the top, it's going to be 103 foot-pounds. So we're going to start with the bolts. So from here, we're going to go straight down to the bottom. And now from here, we're going to go straight up to the top on the forward front side of the axle. And then while we're here, we're going to adjust our torque wrench down to 28 foot-pounds and move straight down underneath this one to the backing plate nut and torque that down. And then we'll move straight across to the other side to the other backing plate nut. And then our top nut here, which is going to be 103 foot-pounds. So we're going to loosen these two bolts down the bottom here, holding our knuckle in. We also have one at the top. We'll focus down here first. This inside head here is going to be a 14 millimeter, and the nut, there's two nuts actually back here. The outside one is going to be the first to come off, and that's going to be a 17. So this inside nut here, you can see it's a little loose, which means it's not threaded on. All right? So what we're going to do now, try and tap back our bolt that runs right through here. So that loosened up this nut for us to come all the way off. And you can see it's not perfectly round, so it is keyed to this bolt here. So we're going to leave this just the way it is for now, because all we're going to need to do is swing the knuckle down. We don't need to fully take the knuckle off. We may decide to do that, but we're going to start with the knuckle just swung down, so this is fine. We'll do the same thing here. So now our front bolt is going to be a 17 millimeter on the inside, and 17 millimeter on the front side. So again, the goal here is just to loosen these up enough to swing the knuckle down. So we'll stop here. If that allows us to swing it down, we're good. If not, we'll loosen these up a little more. And now our top bolt is going to be a 17 on the front and an 18 on the back on the nut here. Now the top bolt we have to remove completely. At this point, be ready for your suspension to shift slightly when you pull this bolt out. There's your bolt. I'm going to take this top arm and just lift it up a little bit out of the way. And now we can take our knuckle and parking brake assembly, and we're going to try and roll this forward or out. I'm going to make sure our axle stays in. And the goal here is to get the axle out of the knuckle. Now you have your parking brake cable, which is still attached through your backing plate. Just make sure you're keeping an eye on that. You don't want to overstress and break that. So we're going to pull forward, and we're going to pull forward on our knuckle and pull inwards on our axle. And the goal, like I said, is to get the axle out of the knuckle. All right, once the axle's out of the knuckle, I'm going to put it up and out of the way on the rear sway bar. We can now push our knuckle upwards just a little bit. So we've set up our hub in our presser, and this is one option to do it while it's in the vehicle. All right, so we have a plate on the back up against our bearing and a plate in front pulling in our hub. You want to make sure your hub is really flat to your bearing surface here. You want to pull it in very flat, very even. There's a break in the bearings, there's a gap in the bearings. You don't want to send this into that, or you'll pop the bearing into pieces. Now that we have it set up, we'll go ahead and tighten it down and start to pull our hub in. So we had to swap the tool around to get the 24 millimeter of our tool on this side. So we'll just continue now to pull in the rest of our hub all the way. And once it's bottomed out and your hub is all the way in, go ahead and back out your tool if you're using this method. So this is how we were set up in the vehicle. Plate on the back side holding the bearing together, plate on the front pulling the hub in. So on the inside here you can see that your hub is fully seated all the way into the bearing, and the bearing is still flat and even and not separated. That's what you want to see. So now before we put our axle back in, we'll just put a very light coat of grease on the splines. Now we're going to take our axle and line it up with our hub. Now the goal here is to bring our hub up to the axle and get our splines to interlock before we try and push the two together. Otherwise they're not going to go together. So we're going to push the hub up and then angle our axle into it. Now once you get them close, what you can do is spin your hub to get your splines to align on the axle. So now we have our knuckle almost back into position. And you can tell because if we pull our top arm down, we're just about there. We're going to push our knuckle backwards till it meets up with our top arm. And what I'm going to do here is use this 3/8 extension just to hold it. So now on the inside, looking at the rear wheel axle, we have a little bit left to go to push the splines into the hub. So we're going to get a little creative here. Gently tap that axle in. Once we get a couple of threads to poke through here, we're going to use the axle nut to pull it the rest of the way. So we're going to use a soft mallet on the inside where we can to try and drive that axle forward. So now that we've got our axle to pop through here just enough, what we're going to do is put our axle nut on. This isn't going to be final. When we do our axle nut final, we're going to need to put a little engine oil right here. All we're going to do now is pull our axle as far forward as we can. So we'll thread it on a couple of threads and tighten it down. All right, now we'll go ahead and loosen that up. Now you can see how far we pulled the axle in. So now we can just take our axle nut and loosely put it back on. Now from here, we can work on the top bolt and start to reassemble. So now up top, we have our 3/8 extension holding our top arm in place. So we're going to just follow that with a bolt. thread on our nut. Now we're going to have to torque all three of these areas down with this suspension under load. So we're going to loosely put all the nuts and bolts back in here, then we're going to jack this up, torque it all down under load. So now down here on the bottom of our arm, we have our nut, which if you remember wasn't threaded on. It slides on and it clocks into position. And then on top of that, we do have our nut. So now what we're going to do to simulate load on the vehicle, because we're on a lift, we're going to use a pole jack. We're going to lift our rear suspension. If you weren't on a lift and you were working on the ground, this is when you would use a floor jack. What you want to do is lift your rear suspension on this side to mimic the load of the vehicle on the suspension. Okay, once you've done that, now we can start to torque down our 3 bolts on our knuckle. We're going to start here. Now this bolt here is going to be 43 foot-pounds. And the inside bolt here, or the front bolt, is going to be 42 foot-pounds. And now we can work up top. So now our top bolt on our top arm is going to be 69 foot-pounds. So now that we've torqued down our knuckle, we can lower our pole jack, or at this point you can lower your jack stand or your floor jack. So if you're working on a lift or a jack, what you want to do is torque your axle nut down to 134 foot-pounds. We're on a lift, so we're a little bit higher than usual, so we're going to use a long pry bar between the studs on the hub and pry or pivot it against the ground. This will stop our hub from spinning while we torque the axle nut down. So again, 134 foot-pounds. So now that we have our axle nut torqued, what we're going to do is spin our hub. So we have the axle here in this little cutout facing straight up and down. And the last step to our axle nut is to stake the nut into this cutout in the axle. It's a lot easier to do when it's straight up and down, so you're hammering straight down. We'll go ahead and do that now. So now we're going to use a punch onto the axle nut and stake that into place. So So now what we're going to do is reinstall our speed sensor. And there's a notch that we're looking to align in the bearing. So now that you have your speed sensor pressed all the way down, you can go ahead and install our bolt. So right here we have our bracket for our brake hose. So we'll take that bolt out. We're going to take our caliper and we're going to feed it through underneath our speed sensor and upper arm. And again, if you didn't do this step, that's fine. You won't need to be moving your caliper around if you didn't do that. But what you will need to do is reattach now your bracket onto the knuckle. So we'll take our bolt and our brake hose bracket, so there is a little shoulder here that you're going to have to get on the back side of this bracket into position. And then this bolt is a 12 millimeter. Go ahead and tighten it down. So now from here, we're going to put our rotor on, and you'll notice we have 2 threaded screw holes on our hub. We're going to align the 2 countersunk screw holes here with those. You can see our rotor slides easily on. If for some reason your rotor doesn't slide over your parking brakes, you'll have to come down below here and adjust your wheel to bring your parking brakes in to get your rotor to clear. Once you have your rotor on, go ahead and replace your Phillips screws. We only have one for this vehicle. You would be replacing both or reinstalling both. Once you're done with that, we can move on to the caliper. So now we're going to take our caliper bracket, put it into position, and thread in our 2 bolts. We're going to snug these bolts up, and we'll come back and torque them down. We're going to torque these 2 caliper bracket bolts to 41 foot-pounds. Now we're going to reinstall our pads. We're going to put the wear indicator on the bottom inside. We're going to take our caliper and put it into position. Now because we're using the same pads, we're not replacing the pads. The fact that the piston is out slightly is okay. It should fit. But if you're replacing your pads, you're going to want to compress your piston to get over the new depth of your pads. So once your caliper is in place, we can thread in our 2 bolts. You'll notice on the caliper bracket where the pins are, you have these nuts here. If while you're threading in your 2 bolts, those spin, we'll have to back them up with a wrench. And we'll snug these up. Again, keeping an eye on this nut here. Looks good. All right, we'll come back, torque it down. We're going to torque our 2 caliper bolts to 16 foot-pounds. So when I do a wheel, I like to put on top and bottom lug nut, rock back and forth, continue to tighten them down by hand. This just helps you get it nice and flat against the rotor. Give it a look, looks good. So we're going to snug these up in a crisscross pattern. And then we'll lower it down, put the tire on the ground, and torque them down. So now that we've lowered the vehicle down, our tire's on the ground, we're going to go ahead and torque down our lug nuts to 79 foot-pounds. We're going to do it in a crisscross pattern.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.